Welcome to the Personal Edge Fitness Podcast with Garrett Williamson. Health, wellness, exercise, nutrition, and a whole lot more. Got questions? Call us and leave a message at 251-278-EDGE or message us at Personal Edge Fitness on Facebook and Instagram, at Team PE on Twitter, or personaledgefitness.com.
Hey everybody, and welcome again to the Personal Edge Fitness Podcast. I'm your host, Garrett Williamson, president of Personal Edge Fitness. Thank you so much for listening. Have y'all noticed that there's a lot of these different fitness facilities that are popping up, or fads, I guess you'd say, that are popping up, and a lot of them are based on short, quick, fast burst, what have you, type training. You've got 20 minutes of this, 30 minutes of this. Kind of things makes me think back to Father Guido Sarducci. Am I saying that right, Pablo?
Yeah.
Father Guido Sarducci? Yeah, okay, great. Okay. Of Saturday Night Live fame, he did some stand-up and stuff too. He had a famous thing on, he was being interviewed on Weekend Update, and he was talking about a new book that he was going to come out with. You know, he's making a few dollars for the Vatican or what have you. And he said he was going to come out with the 7-minute ab book. And the reason he was coming out with the 7-minute abs, he said, you know, you're looking at, I can't do the accent, you know, but I mean, looking at if you're looking at the bookshelf, they had an 8-minute ab book out at that time. And you see 8-minute abs, and you look right next to it, and you got 7-minute abs. Well, you know, of course, that's better. You're going to buy that. Sure. But anyway, brief fitness and attacking it. And it makes me think back to something I was asked recently on a radio interview, and that was talking about fads in fitness and what have you. And I was talking about one of the running themes, this fast working out and what have you. I get a lot of questions about this, about, wow, people coming in that haven't done any fitness whatsoever, and they've heard that, hey, you can do this stuff in 15 or 20 minutes, you know, it's no problem whatsoever. And it gets people really excited. And they want to know, what's that all about? What's this new fad? What is all this stuff out here? Well, it's actually not new. It's been around for many years. Today I want to talk to you a little bit about what we call HIIT, H-I-I-T. That's HIIT training, or high intensity interval training. What is it? Why do we do it? Where did it come from? Is it good? Is it bad? Should I get involved? The whole 9 yards. Now, I like to start everything when I'm talking about a certain word or talking about a certain subject. Usually I start with the definition. I like to start with this one, of the history of high-intensity interval training. We think of it as something that's kind of new because it's gotten really popular. And just like fitness is like everything else, everything old is new again. The wheel constantly gets reinvented. Like many aspects of fitness, there's just some old rules that never really change. If you want to lose weight, it's pretty simple. Get your book out for this one. Take in less than you expend. That's been since day one. That's going to be here, now, and forever. Amen. If you're interested in increasing your anaerobic capacity, well, high-intensity interval training is where you should be. And actually, it started, the first records of high-intensity interval training started back in 1910. If you're a runner, you're probably been running for a while, been doing a lot of training or training for races. You're probably familiar with what is known as fartlek. F-A-R-T-L-E-K, fartlek training. That's a Swedish word. It actually means interval. Back in 1910, a guy named Paavo Nurmi, who was a runner, had a trainer named Lauri Pikala. Now, I'm sure I'm butchering that word. They put together an interval training system for their training sessions. And also at the time, a Finnish gold medalist who ran in the Olympics, named of Hans Kolmanen. I may stick with fitness and stay away from some of these Finnish words, what have you. But they also use interval trainings. The runners focused on switching from fast to slow jogging intervals during training to improve stamina and strength. And believe it or not, that's a form of HIIT training. The definition of HIIT training is interval-based training, anaerobic capacity interval-based training. And let me back up a little bit and talk about what anaerobic versus aerobic is. Let's get down to exactly what HIIT training is. It's anaerobic training. Anaerobic is simple. It sounds like a complicated word. It makes me sound like I earned my bachelor's degree and my master's degree. But anaerobic is simple. It means without oxygen. Now, my friend and idol and our biggest hero in this industry, who is Dr. Kenneth Cooper, coined another word, which I'm sure that most of you are familiar with. It sounds a lot like that, which is aerobic. It means with oxygen. In 1960, he wrote a book called Aerobics, where he actually coined that word, and it's the whole reason why it entered into our lexicon. And as a matter of fact, that book is why I work in a multi-billion-dollar industry, and that's more information for another podcast. But you've got aerobic and you've got anaerobic. All right, getting to the reality of each one of those. Aerobic means bringing your heart rate up to about 70% of your maximum. Your ability to keep it there for a certain amount of time, typically 30 minutes and whatever. We call that conversational pace. If you're a little out of breath, but you know, you can sit there and complain about how much you're out of breath for the next 30 to 40 to hour. That's aerobic. You may think like you're anaerobic, but I promise you, you are aerobic, and that is with oxygen. Now, if you're going out and sprinting, Okay, those of you that have paid attention to our previous podcast, you'll know that that is me taking a sip of my water. That means we're doing the drinking game again. I'm trying to hit my 100 ounces of water. I hope you're doing the same, so that means take a drink right now. The aerobic training means with oxygen. That's that 70% of your maximum rate, conversational pace. Anaerobic means without oxygen, and I was talking about sprinting. It's the whole reason we can't sprint for hours and hours and hours, because it means without oxygen. I'm going to get a little scientific on you. I was a kid in school. I was the kid that always raised my hand and asked that question that all parents love. Why? Why, Mrs. Johnson? Why? Don't just tell me something. Don't tell me that anaerobic capacity means without oxygen. Just tell me you get out of breath when you sprint. I want to know why. So I'm going to get into the why of that. So what's happening there is obviously you're expending a lot of energy. I'm sure that didn't get by any of our listeners there. But you're expending a lot of energy. And the reason you're expending a lot of energy is that your muscles are firing. Especially in the sprint, you've got large muscle groups, the quadriceps, the glutes that are firing. And they're demanding a lot of energy. And oxygen equals energy. Where is it getting the energy from? Well, it's getting it from oxygenated blood. That muscle is firing, and what's making it fire is getting nutrients to it. What's getting the nutrients to it? Well, that's your heart pumping, and it's pumping blood, but it's not just pumping blood, it's pumping oxygenated blood. So therefore, your pulmonary system gets involved. All right. Why did I go from the neck bone to the leg bone to the shoulder bone? Why did I go through all that? Well, because I want to get to expanding the lungs. Now, you think about your heart's a muscle. It's about the size of your fist. The lungs are controlled by one of the strongest muscles in the body. It takes a lot of energy to expand your lungs. I can tell you, and actually you've proved this to yourself before, when you've ever gone to lift something heavy and you've held your breath when you've done it. Now that's called the Valsalva maneuver. Gosh, this guy's intelligent, man. He knows all these incredible words. I'm just so impressed with him. But actually it is. It's called by the Valsalva maneuver. It's when your body cuts off the oxygen in order to lift something heavy, because your body knows that it takes a lot of energy to expand the lungs. The serratus is involved in that, pulls those lungs apart. That takes a heck of a lot of energy just to expand them, which again, if your lungs are having to expand in order to get oxygen to the blood so the blood can get it to the legs to move, well, it's taking energy to expand those lungs. Here we're requiring more energy, more oxygen. That's why you end up running out of breath. That's why your body at some point in time, if you keep sprinting, it will pass out or shut down your whole system. That's what anaerobic training is. Wow, that was a long way to get there, wasn't it? Let's get back to HIIT training and why I bring up anaerobic and why people do interval or HIIT training. The benefits to high-intensity interval training are very simple. They increase your anaerobic capacity. Now, you've heard a lot about aerobic capacity, and can I run a 5K? Yeah, I can run a 5K. All right. Can you train hard enough to run maybe an 8K? Yeah, I can train hard enough to run an 8K. Maybe you can run a marathon, and you can run it at a certain pace. Well, that's aerobic capacity. But folks, the reason that training for anaerobic capacity is so important is because that's basically how most of us live. I seriously doubt you wake up in the morning and you get a phone call that says, hey, Bob, at about 2 o'clock today, everything's going to go kablooey, and your stress level is going to jump through the roof. You got plenty of time to plan for it, not a problem. It's going to go up to about, it's going to be mediocre stress, and it's going to be consistently for about an hour and a half, buddy, and then you're going to be fine. That's not what happens. You wake up in the morning, climb out of bed, the kids are screaming, you're jumping up, you're having to go make breakfast, or you're late to work, or the alarm went off at the wrong time, or you're at work and your boss drops something on your desk and says, look, this is 400 pages of this and I need it yesterday. That's what happens. That's stress. That stuff that gets thrown on you, your heart races. We live anaerobically. And so that's why the anaerobic training is so important. Believe it or not, it is so important that it's made it into aerobic training. I'll get to that in just a minute. So I've given you a definition of anaerobic versus aerobic. And the HIIT training, high intensity interval training, is that short burst, quick recovery, hopefully, anaerobic training. And usually you don't do high intensity interval training for a long, long time. You don't see people doing high intensity interval training for an hour or so. It's best recommended to go more intense, but go for short bursts, 10 minutes, 20 minutes at the most. If you're doing interval sessions that last 30 minutes or an hour or so, then you should be taking breaks in between. The reason being is that you're tearing a lot of muscle fibers typically when you're doing this. If you're tearing muscle fibers, well, we're planning on tearing muscle fibers. That's how our muscles grow. But if we tear too many, as anybody that's had an injury knows, you're going to get pulled muscles. You're going to get severe damage to the muscle and not recover quite the way you want to recover. So that's why we keep these sessions brief. And what that does is it actually increases your ability to recover. That's the way I describe anaerobic capacity to a lot of my clients, is your ability to sprint, recover, sprint, recover, sprint, recover. And just like the example I gave earlier about stress, if you're handling a lot of stress and you get a lot of stuff thrown on you, you want your heart rate to speed up, capillaries to expand, all that blood flow to be able to get to those different muscles and be able to do that quickly and then have it shut down and go back to normal quickly. Recovery rate of heart rates is ways of measuring this and what have you. You'll actually increase that ability to recover. And so those stressful situations, they're much easier on you. And keep in mind, I always leave this at the bottom because I mentioned the thing about stress, but I'm such a fan of this type of modality of exercise because it's basically, like I said earlier, it's how you live. It's exactly how we live. If you can handle high-intensity interval training, you can typically handle most aspects of life, let's put it that way. There's an added benefit to high-intensity interval training for athletes, not only sprint athletes, and not only anaerobic capacity power lifters and this kind of thing, but believe it or not, it happens to be the number one way to train for aerobic or endurance type races, 5Ks, what have you. Any kind of endurance sport. The best way to train for it nowadays, we have found out over many years of research, is through anaerobic training. And why? Aerobic is not super hard to attain. Once you've built up that aerobic capacity, which you can do over time through building up through, like if you're a runner, building up through a 5K, building up to an 8K, moving up to a half marathon, this kind of thing. The most important part of all that is, again, the elasticity in those vessels and your body's ability to recover. Taking another drink there, going to 100 ounces. The thing about the anaerobic training and the benefits to endurance athletes is, again, back to that thing I was talking about earlier about your ability to recover. In an aerobic session or endurance session, you're tearing fibers on your muscles just like you are in any kind of exercise. The reason you're sore the next day, that burning sensation that you feel in your muscles is lactic acid being introduced into the system because you've got muscles tearing, therefore they burn, therefore they're telling your body, screaming at you to stop. Your ability to deal with that lactic acid, your ability to repair or keep blood flow coming to that muscle is your ability to be fast, is your ability to continue running, is your ability to continue doing whatever endurance program that you may be involved in. They're finding now that because of the injuries occurred through long bouts of exercise, because of that, they're finding that it's far more beneficial, not only because of the energy transfer I talked about earlier, but also it's far beneficial to do the more short burst training, especially if you've warmed up for it and you're ready for it, because you're able to get your exercises done, you're able to push that heart rate up, you're able to push that lung system, what have you, without the risk of prolonged repetitive movements, prolonged repetitive stress on the muscle. Therefore, you got less of a chance of injury. And there's several studies that prove that training for endurance exercise or endurance racing, endurance activities through anaerobic training, they've seen a drastic reduction in injuries for that. Several years ago, Outside Magazine had a fantastic article on a gentleman who was a professional. He competed in the 50 to 54 age group in the World Championship Ironman, which is the one in Hawaii. It was found that, and he ended up winning the division. It was pretty incredible. For those of you that are familiar with an Ironman is a 2.4 mile swim, 112-mile bike, and a marathon, 26.2 run. Well, they found out that he had only swam maybe a mile, and in any of his training, the longest distance he had done was a mile. His cycling, he had not biked over 60 miles, and in his running, he'd run less than 13 miles at any one time. Now, he'd done it a lot, and what he'd used is he'd used this high-intensity interval training. He had not done any of the rest of it, and mainly it's because of his job. He had a very successful career. His time did not allow him to go out for hours and hours and hours for runs and swims and what have you. And he ended up, of course, with no injuries because not only was he doing anaerobic training where you're breaking down muscle tissue, therefore you're regrowing it, therefore you're making it stronger, but he was not putting that long time on his joint, on his bones, what have you. So therefore, he's pretty much injury-free. He won the darn race. Still, people are going out and doing longer endurance. There's nothing wrong with that. Sometimes that's just for your head. But keep in mind that the best ways to train for endurance training now is through the anaerobic or high-intensity interval training. Okay, I've talked a lot about the what of high-intensity interval training, but what are examples of that? How can you get involved in something like this? Maybe you're not a runner. Maybe you don't do any kind of endurance training. Maybe you're just wanting to get in shape and you like to do it a little shorter. Well, that's one of the carrots or one of the main reasons why people are interested in HIIT training is because you can do it briefly, but you also want to be able to be safe about it. It's also one of the ways that people can get injured really fast in working out and fitness. I told you it's a great way to prevent injuries, and that's true. But the reason that people get hurt is because they rush too fast into it. A lot of these exercises are done because of the very nature of them. They're done fast. Therefore, people mess up on form. They're lifting heavier weight than they should because they may be setting it for a more endurance type workout. So you want to be safe about how you go about this. I'm going to give you some steps to putting together a good HIIT routine. First thing you want to pick out your types of exercises. Now, if you're going to do this through resistance training, which a lot of people do, using either machines, using free weights, it's a fantastic way to go about it. Body weight exercises are fine. Make sure that you take the time before beginning a HIIT program and you've got good form down on whatever exercise you may be doing. Now, if you've never done HIIT training, I wouldn't start with a complicated Olympic lift. I wouldn't start with a power clean. I would maybe start with a squat, some kind of simple movement, not a multi-chain movement. And the reason being is that more movement you've got in there, the more potential for injury. So if you're going to do your first HIIT sessions, I would set it up through some exercises that you know you have really good form on, that you're very comfortable with, that you've done for a long time, and design your program around that to start. I don't encourage anybody to go through a weekend program where you're learning, or a clinic where you're learning Olympic lifting, which I think is phenomenal. It's a fantastic modality. And then immediately starting within 24 to 48 hours, HIIT training with that modality they just learned. You want to make sure that you've got it down pat, because that's when you can run into some injuries. Be careful about selecting your exercises. Make sure you're picking something familiar. Make sure you're picking something that you know really, really well. And then you're designing your splits. Splits are simply how many reps you're doing, time, what have you, the frequency of it. We set all these things up. We set up fitness through frequency, intensity, and time. And one of those three components is going to be part of what we call your split. If you're setting up a program, you're saying, okay, I'm going to do exercise. I'm going to do 3 exercises. That's part of it. And I'm going to pick 30 seconds on each exercise. That would be your time factor. And I'm going to do 3 rounds on all 3 sets. So that would be your frequency. But you want to break down, you want to make sure it's something manageable. You want to make sure that you could do that in an endurance type setting. In other words, if you're going to do squats and you're going to do push-ups and you're going to do pull-ups, those 3 exercises, which are pretty simple, they're body weight and what have you. Well, if you're planning on doing them for 30 seconds each and you're going to do 3 sets, well, can you do squats for 30 seconds? Can you do squats followed by push-ups for 30 seconds? Can you do squats followed by push-ups followed by pull-ups? Make sure you can do it in an endurance or an aerobic setting first before you move into trying to speed up the pace. Therefore, you're making sure you're going to make sure that you're not breaking down, you're not breaking form and risking injury. Number 3 is how this affects your brain. Now, this sounds very strange, I know, but many people, when they're going to exercise, some people like to do that endurance type training. They like to go out and go for that run. That's a release. They're getting away from the kids. They're getting away from their job, whatever, and they're taking some time to themselves. Some people like the anaerobic training, the HIIT training for the same reason. Some people really enjoy, I'm one of these, that enjoys being able to do what I call see the end of the workout before you get started. And what I mean by that is, okay, I've got to do 3 sets of 30 of these. I've got to do 3 rounds, but at the end of this amount of time, 15 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, I know it's going to be tough. I'll be going to the wall really hard, but I'm done with it in 15 minutes. That's fantastic. I can see the end of it. That works great for my brain. It's like a sprint. I got to go hard. I may throw up, but I will be done in this amount of time. That works fantastic for my brain. But if you're a person that gets into a lifting situation or an anaerobic situation like a sprint, and partway through the sprint you just want to quit. Or if you get into a situation where you're doing a lift and you really should do 8 repetitions, you know you can do 8 repetitions, but doing that high level of intensity, you're going to quit. You're going to stop it. You're going to give up halfway through it. If that's the case, then maybe HIIT training isn't for you. And that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. You may speak better to an aerobic session. Still, you're going to be in great shape because of doing aerobic capacity. But if it doesn't work for your brain, then it's not going to work for you. And that also speaks to my underlying theme of all my podcasts. If you don't know much about it, check out episode 1. And that's where I'm talking your level of wellness. It's got to work for your head also. A few risks, though, and I talked about them briefly here, is first thing, speed. I can't say enough about it. Speed is benefit to it. It's a part of pretty well every HIIT training program, but also it's the one that can be the detriment. It's the one that can cause injury because you're not watching your forms. Again, like I said earlier, what exercises are you using? Are you familiar with them? Are you comfortable? Are you okay getting through that session with them? What have you? Be careful if you add speed to this, that's going to mess up your form. Also, you want a good warm-up. It may be a 15-minute workout, but take that 3 to 5 minutes at least at the beginning and get good and warmed up. And a warm-up doesn't mean a sweat. A warm-up doesn't mean I'm warm, it's hot outside, I'm warm. Warm-up means opening up those capillaries, open up those blood vessels. The only way you're going to do that is getting that heart rate increased. Get that heart rate increased, get everything to open up, get past that crest. If you've ever done any kind of sprinting, you have a spike to your heart rate. Get past that spike and go into where it gets into its regular operating rate, somewhere 70, 75. Get to that level before you start. So you want a good warm-up also. And the third thing is to make sure you're monitoring you're monitoring your HIIT training. Have a timer. Have a set number. Have somebody counting. Whatever. You want to make sure you're monitoring. You want to make sure you're monitoring exactly what you're doing. It's not something you can just say, hey, I'm going to lift till I just can't. If you do that, I promise you're setting yourself up for injury. So make sure you've got it monitored. I'm going to hit a number or whatever. If you do that, you're going to stay safe with it. It's one of the best ways to train. I'm a big fan of it. But it's also something I'm concerned about since so many different modalities are using HIIT training. I'm worried that it may go the way Olympic lifting did in the 70s and early 80s. I'm at 72 ounces today. I hope you're keeping up. The way Olympic lifting did, this is something I battled with even into the early 90s when I started training. I dealt with so many people that did not want to do squats. They didn't want to do anything that looked like to resemble Olympic lifting. Why? What happened was Olympic lifting was developed in the 1950s, 1960s. It's been around for years. It patterns our natural movements. It's actually a fantastic modality. But what was happening was that people were doing it fast. They were doing it wrong. And every time they'd go and see their orthopedist on a knee injury or a shoulder injury, they'd ask him, okay, well, what were you doing? The doctor would ask them, what were you doing? And they would say, well, I was doing squats. I was doing Olympic lifting. Well, their first instruction was, of course, don't do that. And once you have an MD tell you, don't do that, and that gets around quite a bit, the doctor says, don't do that, well, that can kill that modality. And I'm worried that HIIT training may go that same way. But no matter what, I've already had people come in and tell me that in my facility, look, I want to start with y'all, but I don't want to do any of that high-intensity stuff, that HIIT training. A friend of mine got hurt doing that. Well, there's nothing wrong with the modality. We don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater on this. So what happened with Olympic lifting? Olympic lifting has now come back in vogue, which I think is fantastic, but it's also been tied to HIIT training. And I'm worried both of them are going to get thrown out if we're not taking these precautions. So I can't stress them enough. Big fan of it. I've been doing it ever since I started training. So I'd heavily encourage you to check it out too. And especially if you're an endurance athlete, you really need to look at the benefits of anaerobic high-intensity interval training. Hey folks, I appreciate you listening to me today. Stay tuned for other episodes coming up soon. This is Garrett Williamson, host of the Personal Edge Fitness Podcast. Thank you so much for listening, and remember, stay hydrated.
Thanks for listening to the Personal Edge Fitness Podcast with Garrett Williamson. Subscribe now and be a part of the show by calling 251-278-EDGE or message us on Facebook and Instagram at Personal Edge Fitness or at Team PE on Twitter, and visit us at personaledgefitness.com.